Howdy do, my flaunties, raunties, and naughties. This is a standalone part of the Valkyr UpdaTTed series. First episode at the eye up there, if you want to see it first, but it's a standalone part, so if you're only interested in the identity of Exalted weapons, just stay with me for now. So, let's start. Oh boy. The identity of Exalted weapons. Gear identity is usually not hard to unpack. At its simplest, it's just take the mods that change how using a weapon feels or augments the manner in which its damage is delivered, and add design consistencies, and that's your weapon class. So rifles, for example, use Hunter's Munitions, Argent Scope, Primed Shred, Bladed Rounds, which makes them peak DPS instead of burst DPS, accurate but calculated, and better at killing groups than for single targets. And Bladed Rounds supports both the peak DPS orientation and the better at groups identity. But Exalted weapons, they aren't united by mods. And with Hildren, not even by method of ammunition. The only thing that consistently unites Exalted weapons is that their use is limited by some factor. Hildren's Shield Waster Horseshoe, for example, drains shield per shot. Most others drain energy per second, and Baruch the Poor Fucker is also limited by his Restraint Meter, which requires the use of energy to lower. So they are limited. In video games, something being limited usually means it's either easier to use or quite simply stronger. And while they most definitely try their best to be limited, most of them can be run permanently with little investment. Hildren just has to use Pillage more often, which she will want to do anyways. Baruch can use Low to decrease his restraint just as fast as Desert Wind increases it, with costs low enough to be self-sustaining throughout the normal level range. Excalibur's energy drain becomes a non-problem for most players even before they gain access to his prime but edgy. So their use being limited isn't the core theme here. I believe it's more having a limiting factor in general. Like, yes, you can use them permanently, but only if you put extra work into that. But if they have an extra layer of investment, said investment needs to pay off somehow. So, are they upgrades to existing weapon categories? Some, sure. Balefire Charger is a genuinely good rocket launcher, although I personally never felt it to be worth the former invested, even with Hildren's Bastille but mobile literally limiting her to this and only this single weapon. And similar goes for Artemis Bow. It's genuinely a strong bow. Not my type of weapon, and I don't feel like it's worth the former, but strong nonetheless. But then there are Wukong's Iron Stick and Valkyr's Talons that, sure, Valkyr's Talons have a gimmick with effective invincibility, but Wukong's Stick? Using Wukong's stick directly nerfs his clone, as he is then also bound into melee. Its stats are just good enough to be technically usable, but it won't overtake weapons with Blood Rush without using the augment and meeting quite a crowd. And its gimmick is what exactly? 1.5 more range than other staffs? This ability is so underused, the wiki doesn't even know if it has a gimmick at all. And then there's Mesa, who sure has an exalted weapon, but it's only and really only used as part of an ability. Sure, you can argue that Peacemaker's auto-aim is the gimmick, but the regulators have a modded peak DPS of 290,000 damage per second. And that's without me calculating status into it. And I don't have all the primed mods maxed yet. And she'd be an exception to that rule. Landslide, Bladestorm, Shattering Lash, and most importantly, Whipclaw are all abilities that stat stick directly off melee mods. Some of them even rarely used ones. So unlike Mesa's standardist of standard secondary build, these literally limit your choice in gear if you ever want to use them. And may I just add that Exalted weapons were officially added to remove stat sticking. And I don't want to think about Garuda's talents. Are they exalted or not? Who knows? They definitely are limited to her exclusively, but don't drain energy when used. And unlike, for example, Valk's talents, have access to both regular stances, including bonus mod capacity, and acolyte mods. Damn no. So where were we before I lapsed? Oh yeah, Exalted weapons seem to be intended as upgrades of existing weapon categories, with an added gimmick that are limited by being only accessible on a certain frame and a secondary limiting factor, or only as part of an ability, I guess, and only exists because you can't nerf Mesa without Mesa players threatening to mail bomb these offices or whatever. I mean, if you play her purely for auto aim, you can be expected to do something like this. Now, if that is the theme the E wants to create for Exalted weapons, may I suggest a few generalized changes. Now, as generalized change, and yes, I mean this as a general change to all Exalted weapons, most of them are relatively fine about power and stuff, but they still have a macro play investment, a bigger picture investment. In this case, formas. The forma investment should simply be lower than average throughout the board. I am sorry, but this is stupid. These weapons are limited to a single warframe, have a secondary limiting factor which usually lowers the ability to use other abilities, and have additional weapon swap time. I thought about quite a few different ways to achieve this, by, for example, simply having more forma included, or letting them simply level quicker, or similar things. I think the best option is to simply let exalted weapons, and I mean all exalted weapons, gain up to 40 levels just like leech weapons, but without the former, of course. That should lower the macroplay investment significantly and reinforce the idea that these are particularly strong weapons. During implementation of this, keep in mind that Garuda's talents effectively won't have these limiting factors, therefore it might be uncalled for to adjust them as well. Additionally, restrictions to Acolyte and Amalgam mods. Oh boy, most of the Acolyte mods have restrictions of their own and strongly influence the identity of their weapon type. And Amalgam mods mainly exist to change the identity of affected weapons, so removing them from the picture seems sensible. Though some of the weapon type identity is formed from other mods. In the case of primaries, it's Hunter's Munitions and Prime Threat, and one can argue about Prime Cryo Rounds, making them better viral users, which is why there are no primary Exalted weapons. For secondaries, their identity as fast-firing, critical-based weapons is primarily reinforced by Lethal Torrent, Barrel Infusion, and Prime Pistol Gambit. And melees gain most of their identity from the fact that they are, well, melee, but they are heavily influenced by Sacrificial Steel, which adds large amounts of damage to the slower heavy attack, but only minor amounts to the light attacks. So if the dilution of Exalted weapon identities is what Digital Extremes tries to prevent here, then they have to consider if that prevention dilutes the identity of Exalted weapons in other ways. Namely that Exalted melees are currently forced into a meta in which they can only really compete with other weapons if they either utilize a heavy attack build or have access to an incredibly strong augment. And even then their heavy attack builds suffer as they have no access to Amalgam Organ Shatter, which significantly speeds up the wind-up time of heavy attacks. I personally do doubt that they want Exalted weapons with their unique effects and stances to be primarily used as yet another heavy attack weapon or forgone entirely. So if that's not what you want them to be, then can I offer you a few ideas in these trying times? Just allowing for Blood Rush to be used would be a bad idea, as it would only be frustrating to build up that combo every time the weapon is used, but also detract from the identity as a temporary power-up, as most builds would entirely focus on keeping the weapon active, as their unstacked power is rather unappealing. But it would be possible to give those weapons both Blood Rush and Weeping Wounds while circumventing these pitfalls by simply giving them an initial combo count at or near their respective combo count cap, which would allow them to always draw maximum effect from those mods. Another possibility would be to have the True and Sacrificial Steel apply the heavy attack bonus to light attacks of Exalted weapons as well. This would also leave it open to use combo count as an added mechanic, similar to how the old Wukong's Iron Stick range extended depending on combo counter, although it would need to start at a normal range. However, this would still deny most of them the high status chance, while in addition limiting their crit chance multipliers to 550, which other melees will exceed once they exceed a combo count of more than 9. And from there on overshoot up to 720, which will account for a difference of 170%. However, Exalted weapons relying on crit chance may not suffer too ill of an effect through this, as their base crit chance is currently increased. However, when adjusting their crit chance to account, their non-exalted counterparts have to be considered, as them falling below the peak DPS of those counterparts may invalidate their use entirely once again, despite of their helpful gimmicks. In the case of Valkyr specifically, her talents need to hold greater strength than most melee weapons, as their range is quite limited. Baruch may suffer less from lowering his base crit chance, as his attacks are not only affected by an incredibly strong augment, but also damage a large area and are aimable like guns. And as he already had a valid use case in the first place, when it comes to Warframe augments, using augments to solve problems is, as much as I hate to admit, a valid option for some of them. Others, however, will scale too well with too many mods to solve any problems with augments. But that evaluation has to be done individually for any Warframe anyways. Side note, existing augments that increase the crit or status chance may need to be reconsidered if large-scale changes are to be implemented. I'm not entirely sure how these can be solved, but if merely crit chance is given via steal mods, then keeping the status augments at their current strength seems reasonable, while crit variants may need to be reconsidered. Similar affects status augments if weeping wounds is to be allowed. However, as stacking more onto a single multiplier which already exceeds the 200% mark is often highly wasteful, crit augments may not need to be changed at all, as their use would simply fade out or find a niche case like most other augments. And that does it for this one. I'm of course not playing all of these frames regularly, so feel free to tell me how broken they'd be if either my changes went into fruition or how weak one or the other exalted gun is. Please keep in mind that I did have an eye on their Wikipedia pages, and I did test most of those I talked about here, specifically for those use cases I talked about here. So naturally, keep it as aggressive and insulting as you humanly can. Anywhomsatively, have a nice week, you damn well deserve it. This is gonna take a while to edit. As always, subscribe to that like button, leave feedback in the comments, and help me make Zenuric just as bad as all the other focus trees. Oh, and postscript, revert gas, you plebeians.